Hello, welcome to Corny and Barrow Unpicked Bordeaux podcast. This is the wrap up edition. Tree, if you can enter a little trumpet there, that'd be great in the edit. But yeah, look, the Bordeaux 2024. On a serious note, we have pretty much finished. We have one more wine ourselves to release, which is the fabulous Petrus 2024, which we will probably do a little separate pod on, but we may have a little discussion on it now. Before I go any further on what we're going to be chatting about, maybe I'll introduce my companions in the room. Do you want to come in one by one?
Indeed, Joseph. Will here. Good to see you.
Hi, Will. Hi, Joe. It's Guy here. Hello, Guy.
And good morning, it's Marc here, affectionately called Ditch.
Mark here. Is that your surname?
Here.
Yeah, the
Marc
Ditch.
Ditch here. Marc, yes.
Lovely to have you on board. Yeah, perfect to have you actually within the wrap up one. So glad you could make it. So yeah, I mean, let's sort of kick into a bit of chat and conversation about it. So Bordeaux 24, curtains almost fully down. How do we feel it's gone? Who would like to sort of jump in first?
I think financially, it's probably, Mark said a little bit about how we've done, but actually I noticed that when we were sort of conservatively estimating what we might do from the campaign in terms of the open market releases, we've actually come in pretty much bang on what we thought, which could have been way wrong if the prices had been very low. Then obviously you've got to sell more wine to get there. But it's come out, dare I say it, sort of disappointingly predictable.
I think we were cautious with our estimate, and I guess at the back of our minds we sort of hoped that we might outperform our caution, but we've come in pretty much as we thought we would, as you say. So it's not a disaster in that sense. Yeah, no, I'd agree.
Mark, how does that look?
Yeah, in terms of figures, we're just under half compared to last year, close to hitting our budget. I think we're okay to say that. But it's been I've felt a very protracted campaign. It's been end of April. It's been a good few weeks now. But it has been difficult. You have to go through all the motions of an on-prim campaign. So that takes up quite a lot of resource. And I think it's honest to say that margins are quite low when it comes to on-prim and offering these wines out. So, but you still have to dedicate enough time and resource and marketing to actually sell these wines. So to make this money, to make this return doesn't come easy. And we've had to work harder than last year because prices have been down. So it's been a difficult one.
Yeah,
for sure.
I think going back to your point, I think we had, and what Guy touched on as well, we did discuss in great detail about the campaign, how we thought it was going to, how it was going to work, how successful it was going to be, and obviously following a big one for us last year, and generally a pretty decent 2023 campaign. We knew it was going to be less. The quality, obviously, we were aware it's on the lesser side overall from estate to estate. But then it was going to be how was pricing going to be made and met with that. And it sort of kind of puts us in a position where when we looked at 22 and 21, we were realistic there, and we could use them actually as quite good case models because it felt, bar 19, 22 here and there, and then 16, all the other campaigns, it's always felt that you've had these maybe 12 to 15 estates that have got their, and that's been maybe on the generous side, have got their pricing correct in those vintages. And therefore there was interest, there was some revenue, there was some profit to be made. Here we've definitely had more sort of spread of wines coming out at a better price, but the actual where people have ended up sort of really jumping in on lines and volumes has been probably maybe even further reduced. I mean, we did very well at the sort of the top end, if you like. So first growth that came out, they've sold relatively well, bar Margot. So we can dissect that, possibly a timing thing. And, on the last podcast, Guy, you mentioned sort of fatigue, which I think is a good point. And then there's a few here and there on the open market outside of the big guns, outside of Cheval, outside of Mouton, Lafite, etc. Things like Carme Brion and which have done okay. But mostly, I think people's attitudes, which is what we should definitely have a look and chat on, are that I don't necessarily need to buy these now, even if this is the cheapest vintage I have that is available in the market. I don't think I need to buy it now, and so that's we'll come back onto that as a
I mean,
point.
it was quite interesting. We actually, I think it's fair to say, outperformed last year. I think we were probably one of the few merchants who had a better 23 than 22.
That's true.
Which was good. Probably means we could have done more in 22, but that would be the negative way of looking at it. But yeah, it's been more tricky. But I mean, Mark, what's the availability ex Bordeaux like? So
It's still good. A few chateaux are closing off their offers to negotiants.
right,
Having just spoken to a negotiant who will remain nameless now, you can actually still access ex-chateau stock still. So there is availability. At the first growth level, there's a couple of wines, Lafite, Margot, where we're running a little bit short. Besides
Okay.
that, I think like the Clarendon wines, you can still have strong access of. But we're taking up slack from other markets. You have to remember, America not buying,
Yeah.
with the exchange rates, Asia not buying. So the slack is having to be taken up by us. So there's a far bigger pool of wine to access than previous years, even more than 22 possibly.
And has there been much chat of turning down allocations and broking the vintage in a way?
Yeah, most definitely. I'm worried about the smaller negotiants. Every day I'm getting requests from negotiants to try and please buy just a few more cases here and there just to help them
Yeah.
in terms of their cash flow, because they have to take these allocations at the risk of losing them in future years. And if you're looking at 25, which hopefully was going to be a great vintage,
Yeah.
the sides and markers of a good one leading up to the summer and the August. So they are concerned. They don't want to be left holding the baby. Like, it's kind of
Yeah, I mean,
a lot of money to be held up in wine still.
I've just pushed back a little bit on that, Ditch. I mean, they only have to take the allocations year in, year out if everybody else is also taking their allocations. If there's a wide scale revolt, if you like, or the sort of, the market says enough is enough, then the system will have to change. If nobody is taking up allocations, then it's thrown back to the chateau and they'll have to price it at a more competitive level. What I'm more concerned about this year is that we have seen some big price drops, and by and large, the percentage drops that the UK trade, for example, were asking for have been met, and the sales have still not been great. And so that makes me think that there's a more structural issue at hand. And do customers simply not have the patience or the desire to cellar certain types of Bordeaux for the requisite number of years? I mean, if you compare it with Burgundy, we were discussing this morning with somebody, there are some 22 Burgundies that are already drinking beautifully. And, you can start to get these great wines out of your reserve. Okay, they might not be showing at peak, but you can start approaching Pinot and Chardonnay that much earlier than you can Cabernet or Merlot or Cab Franc or whatever it might be. So I think the lead time for enjoying Bordeaux is so long that maybe the pricing is only one element of it, and maybe people are actually looking at the lead time being so long that they'll buy Bordeaux when it's ready to drink. Yeah, I mean, it is. Let's remember, it is compounded by the most difficult market conditions we've had for a while, which we've elaborated on many a time already, and don't need to go back into any of that. So that attitude has been, I think, increased from an analytical point of view on a customer. Oh, do I want to be buying 24 in any serious volume? Do I want to be dabbling at all? Even with those, and I agree, even with the price drops, it's a shame that we haven't seen bigger, a take up on particularly that sort of mid-tier, where you've got the likes of things such as, we mentioned on the last podcast, I mentioned Chevalier Rouge. I mean, Calm Haut-Briand did, but Cantenac Brown, Ducru Bucaillot, these are all wines which came out at really strong prices. Yet hasn't translated into any real sort of serious traction through us. It may be the case that other merchants have had a bit more success, but on the whole, and speaking to other people in the trade, it sort of seems to be a similar feeling. So with that in mind, that's where the concern is, and it's how do we help address that? And I think with what you're saying about the drinking earlier styles where we have fine in other regions, maybe not being replicated and mirrored in Bordeaux. Some do. I mean, we did a tasting yesterday, a blind tasting.
I can't believe you got to mention. I was going to mention that. Yeah, but I think that would be a good one to mention on the next pod because we don't know what the wines were.
Yeah,
we
the
have
results.
on some.
Absolutely.
This is for those who follow us on social media might have seen pictures and things, but we did 20 Bordeaux's completely blind.
22.
Even Mr. Seddon wasn't allowed to know what they were. So we will report back on that. I do think people drink it. I mean, I think that 17, as I've said a couple of times on the pod, is a classic example of a vintage people can be encouraged to broach earlier. And I think that is an important part of it. I guess maybe what you're sort of alluding to, Guy, a little bit is that there's a strong argument that it's it's too little too late in terms that these reductions, had these reductions come 2 or 3 years ago, maybe with the 21 vintage or with 17 or something, then people would have stayed more engaged. Whereas I think there is a certain cohort of customers who can potentially be won back, but who look at it and go, well, it's a crap vintage in a difficult market, which is, always there are massive exceptions to that. But they're saying it's a difficult vintage, a difficult market. Of course, they've dropped their prices, and the Neil Martin article that people may have read on Vinous, which is pretty savage. And I should think Neil's inbox has been quite busy with opinion, or maybe it's maybe the opposite actually. But I think there is a market for Bordeaux to come back. But I think we've all got to collectively get people drinking a vintage like 17.
I totally agree. I mean, I don't want to be too doom and gloom about this. And the message I would like to send is that people do maybe want to drink their wines a little bit younger than they did in the past. And actually winemaking styles are adjusting to reflect that now. I think the takeaway, without knowing what the exact wines were from our blind tasting yesterday, was that what I assume were maybe some 2022s in there. They were quite young, okay, and you wouldn't necessarily choose to drink 22s at the top end. But there were some lovely 17s, for example, as you've mentioned.
Yeah.
And, you don't need to wait a long time for Bordeaux to come round these days. So, I think there is hope for the system. And I think with changing customer tastes and with changing winemaking styles, we can find some sort of happy medium where it does still make sense to buy wines en primeur. But I think there are certain fundamental things that need to be tweaked before we can get to a position where we're happy.
If you were a chateau owner, what would you do going into next year? What's the approach? Is it a sort of direct to...
Well, I was interesting. I was going to make a point on that because
money. I mean, that's a dedicated sales team in the territory of your...
Well, no, indeed, yeah. So in terms of a PR point of view, but just sticking onto the market because this should be a bit of a shockwave campaign for them because they've come down in quite significant percentage terms and cost terms for pricing. Hasn't been as successful as they probably maybe thought they would have. They maybe have released lesser wine, and so they're already prepared to be, taking a stock position on 2024 as an estate. But if 25, and I hope this shockwave is a big one because we've been trying to get this message across for many times. We've been involved in letters. We did our survey independently and with serious conversations last year. And, we have taken it to them. It's a bit boring to say, surely they're going to listen this year because we have repeated that sort of phrase quite often. This is definitely the most damning overall for them in terms of feedback because you've got critics coming out doing these articles which are very punchy. The trade itself is being vocal on where their failures are and not necessarily focusing on some of the successes, and there are some successes which we'll come on to in a moment. But my point was going to be, if 25 is, and history with fives is pretty good with the ending in 5, if it is a good vintage, the drops that they've come down at the moment, they cannot go back up to those prices. And so hopefully with the combination of that sort of just, plain facts that if they were to jump up, they're just going to have a failure because all of a sudden it looks like they've hiked their prices back up and they're going to get slammed. So they're going to be sort of straight away discouraged to go down that route. If the warning signs have really sort of permeated and sunk in, they may even keep them the same or even another drop, which would then encourage a little bit of a reset. And I think that's the communication that we would probably want to see, and which we have done. We did it this trip. Is a reset isn't a bad thing. I know a lot of people are going to say, well, what about the older vintages? How does that affect those pricing? Ultimately, this now has become, that will become a symptom of a market being a market. And I hate to talk about wine just being in terms of a market on its own, but you have this with everything else. the combination of inflated prices, attitudes, other people getting involved, which are, people who decided to come in during all sorts of trends. When crypto went crazy, people were coming in, spending a lot of money on wine, watches had all of that knock-on effect has seen this inflation. So it needs to have that reset to get back to the consumer.
I totally agree. And I was going to say almost exactly the same in that the acid test is we've seen in a trickier vintage, and actually 24's got some lovely wines about it. And I think the perception is low. So I think there's going to actually be a big upside on 24 ultimately, because I think people will enjoy them more than maybe they expected. But I totally agree. The way back for Bordeaux, if you're talking about the top chateaus, and a lot of the more junior ones are really struggling, but if you're talking about the top chateaus, let's say sort of first, second, third growth, is how they next price a good vintage.
Yeah.
A really great vintage, because if they then start looking turn themselves in and look at Bordeaux and price themselves compared to their neighbours and what they, in a way, what they can get away with price, then they really are sort of, killing a golden goose. If they look globally and they think, right, we've got a lot of competition from other people, a lot of people aren't drinking just Bordeaux, Bordeaux's got a smaller slice of the cake than it had 15 years ago, 10 years ago even. I think that's what they've got to do, and they've got to look at the consumption.
Yeah,
and they've got to make sure that they're working with negotiations who are spreading the wine. That and I was talking to some guys in the trade about this recently at a lunch, and what we mustn't, or what some of the merchants who are more investment orientated, which we try actively not to be, suddenly to say, oh, we've got a good vintage and sell 5 and 10 cases of one wine to one customer and the wine sells out and everyone's happy. That's just shoving it into the distribution channel. 10 cases need to go to 10 customers who want to drink it. Now, 1 or 2 of them might sell it later for whatever reason, death, divorce, school fees, all the reason people sell wine. But we mustn't kid ourselves and just start treating it, or the trade start treating it like a trading scenario when the next vintage comes along. And it's always the problem, because the best price for the drinker is also, sadly, when there's an opportunity for the investor.
Yeah, I mean, it is
so it comes down to merchants really making sure that they're favouring those who want to pull corks.
Yeah, because I do think actually, UK customers, as a just sort of a generalisation, are quite, with Bordeaux and Primeur, their reflex initially is very much led on price, isn't it? And I'm not saying that, this is where people are buying to sell. This is whether they're buying to consume. And I think so our market feedback from a London and UK point of view will be, that price is very, very important, because it kind of sets the tone originally.
Yeah.
I mean, and there's been many occasions, this vintage included, and actually you could argue the sort of last certainly 3, Lafite came out and tried to set a tone of, really compelling pricing at a quite high quality wine, and unfortunately just didn't translate. And I think that's it. The PR side of things now needs to be managed better as well from the estates. And what I mean by that is, help us help you, almost, help the markets help you sell Bordeaux. And if that's done through, more retrospective tastings, events in different markets. So I get your point, Mark, as well. They can't afford to obviously put on a sales team. So it feels like the negociant crutch is always going to be there as the main component for them to sell wine into the, around the world, because it's just, forget the en-primeur ethos to begin with about buying in futures and buying cheaper. But in order for them to actually have, a sales team dedicated globally, if you like, to getting these wines around, lean on them. Get them to be coming over and doing more events, more, if there's some sort of collaborations to be done with incentivization on pricing. But you've really got to try, I think, to really, these vintages of the last 10 years, which, if there is a reset, will sort of fall within a potential oblivion almost, with a lot of potentially.
I think if you're selective, there's never been a better time.
Get over and look at them, yeah.
If you want to drink Bordeaux in the next 10 years, there's never been a better time to buy it.
Yeah.
But I think there are 2 different types of buyer. One is the traditional buyer, if you like, who's been buying for the last decade.
Yeah.
And they feel a bit bruised, to put it mildly, by what happened in 9 and 10, and the fact that they've seen their collection of wine lose value over the years. And then there's the younger drinker, or the sort of newer person to the world of wine.
Yeah.
And stylistically these days, big, structured tannic red wine is not necessarily what they're looking for. Now, I'm not saying it's not great wine, because I genuinely think it's brilliant and it's never been better, but it's not quite hitting the zeitgeist at the moment. And I think these things go in cycles. So I think, styles will change, what people are looking for will change, and there will come a time when Bordeaux is back in fashion again. But actually, that's what you need. You need a younger generation of drinkers to be really
100%.
hooked by it and taking it to lunches and showing it to their friends.
Because there's so many customers who've got 8 to 15 vintages within their reserves, and so when they came to 24, it's like, I just don't. I've got plenty to drink. I've got plenty. I don't need it. But again, coming back to the Bordeaux, what I'd encourage them to do as a message is, I know they don't have lots of older stock, but even if they've got 12s or 14s or things, release some of those at properly well priced points, so we can go to those younger customers and say, look, okay, I hear the argument, you've structured style, it does need a bit of time to come around, but here's what this will start to look like, and get some real momentum around getting people drinking the wines, and that's where they could come in and help.
But going back to the sort of mechanics of the system, because that's where we started this, I do fear for the smaller chateaux. I mean, Ditch, you were talking about the smaller negotiants, but I mean, I think also the smaller producers. We're seeing a fundamental shift from a system whereby they could sell the majority of their production up front to a system where they're going to have to face the reality that they're going to need to sell wine once it's physical and in bottle. And to breach that gap, to get from one system to the other, has a huge cash flow implication for these small, in some cases.
That's storage, because the negotiants are doing all that storage for them.
Exactly. So they're paying for the cost of storage, they're paying for the loss of cash flow. And, will they be able to get across that gap? I mean, I don't know.
Yes, no, real mixed bag.
Well, Neil Martin alluded to the fact there's a few chateaux that are privately up for sale, but I don't know.
Oh, I
chateaux.
think there are quite a
few.
But
Public domain maybe, but it's. Would you, when it comes to the mechanics of the campaign, would you still create that sense of urgency on the day of daily release? I mean, it's been 5-6 weeks or so, or would you try and reduce that and try?
I think that element is something that they're aware that they needed to be better at, and I think they have been. There's more transparency. There's a little bit more of a view. And actually, okay, the campaign felt a little bit protracted because the last third probably took twice as long as it should have done.
Yeah.
But I think they've got slightly better at that, and I think they would be crazy to move away from having this slot in the calendar.
I think for the vast majority, it does work well. And I think, having a little bit of impetus and having some excitement, and, there is a core of customers who love that, and we love it as well. So when a campaign works well, I think it does help to sort of generate the buzz that you need. But I think there are other chateaux, and I'm thinking here about people who maybe work directly with merchants in certain markets, where it makes me question whether they actually need to be part of the en primeur kind of circus at all. And they would almost benefit from taking their wine out of that sort of basket and presenting it almost at a different time of year or in a different format, and you could do a totally different release and give it its own spotlight. So I think, depending on who the estate is, either they benefit from the en primeur kind of excitement, or they would actually stand on their own a bit better.
Yeah. I mean, some feedback from me, definitely. And it's a good point to bring up, is the timing, is the fatigue that came in with the campaign, because I don't think any releases should have ever been after Vin Expo this year. It should have all been taken care of before Vin Expo in Singapore. I think the board lane need to read the room better on when, which I know we've said this for a while, but specifically on just where the general mood and sentiment is at with fine wine buyers. And the best way you get that is obviously listening to dedicated merchants from around the world, particularly the ones with the biggest markets. And I'm not, blowing smoke, but the UK is a huge fine wine market, obviously, as US is, but it's very different this year because of what with Trump's tariffs. Obviously, they want to listen to domestic, but there always seems to be some resistance at times. I feel that listening to the UK market, they're just banging the same drum, they're playing the same tune. But actually, we've got probably one of the best feels of our customers' thoughts and mentality. And so read that. Then if it is going to be, fed back that, it's going to be a challenging campaign regardless of what the quality comes out. But if the quality particularly is on the more trickier side, we would think this needs to be concise. This needs to be over and done with relatively quickly. We've seen victims of that. I think Margot is a victim. I know you're saying it's short supply. I don't think we've done particularly brilliant on selling that.
No, there's been a few sales over the last week or so, and it seems to be, again, keep using this word, protracted. There's no sense of urgency, but people are now coming back to wines, and we're still managing to sell. It's not as though last year it felt as though there's a release, and then the very next day that would be the end. That'd be the sort of closure of that sale. But
Yes, there's a little
people
bit
are still customers are tapping back into the first week's releases. So
has Margot volumes the same as Lafite and
no,
if Cheval? That's more my
about
point. Yeah, so I don't think it will. Even though Margot really, it's the cheapest vintage in the market, along with sort of the 17. There's a couple of 21s that were there, but it's not going to hit those volumes. And I think the reason being is because of when it was released. And you've got these other wines, Lalonde, which was a beautiful wine. Again, I mean, they've been on a roll for a long time.
Yeah.
And came out and, the price was okay. And I think it would have done better if it had been released early. Ducru Bucaille would have definitely done better if it had been released earlier. VCC,
they're
I think,
always quite late.
would have,
Yeah, VCC.
it would have done a lot better. Because again, it's a good price. It's only 12 and 11 and 13, which are slightly more different stylistic in awkward vintage VCC. They were underneath this release price, and so that fatigue is something that needs to be addressed from them, definitely. And I think just reading the room, and so what does that mean practically when they're coming back to this calendar of releases? I would actually prefer to see more bigger names come out on one day. I know we don't want it. It's definitely a very difficult balance because you don't want too much because it becomes overwhelming. There's too much. It's too congested. Customers find that they can't really decipher what they want to buy on that day because there's too many potentially good offers. But they need to do some work around that, clearly.
I remember back in the days of the 2010 campaign, one of our sales guys coming into work and saying, I had a nightmare last night that I was stuck on the tube and Lynch Barge had come out and I wasn't able to get to my to my desk to fulfill all the orders. I mean, that sense of urgency is not something that we see.
You don't need to worry about that.
Unfortunately.
Well, there was a time that, to sell a quick anecdote, Mr. Muller, I think, profited. It was a rare Friday afternoon that you were actually in the office, Joseph, rather than out communicating with customers. But most of the rest of us were out with customers, and Cos d'Estornel 16, I think, came out, and you pretty much sold the entire company's allocation.
Well, yeah.
We were left scrapping around on Saturday morning and Monday morning trying to see what we could get. But, you're right. It's changed in that.
It would be lovely to get back to that sort of thing, but I think realistically, it's going to be a more select top tier of estates releasing a smaller amount of wine. And okay, that will generate some buzz because, there is genuine scarcity there if they're only releasing X% of their crop. But I think we need to recognize that there will be a cutoff point and that the rest of Bordeaux probably will need to find some other way of marketing its wines. And if that's, as you say, Joe, getting closer to the consumers, going out there, doing tastings, putting on dinners, doing masterclasses, this is good. It's the hard work that needs to be put in order to show what the wines taste like.
Yeah. And, because there were some people, quite cynical, and Bordeaux's raked it in for a lot of money over the years, particularly since 9 and 10. Look at the investment just in the buildings themselves, all the equipment, how much posher the estates have become, and yada yada. So yeah, if they were to be seen spending some of that money on their consumers, on their market, to really try and infuse but also reinforce the quality that is there, because I think it's just people have just forgotten, that's all. I do remember that 16 actually, because I would like to give a little shout out to our ex-head of broking, Mr. Maris, the Prince of Darkness. If it wasn't for his excellent work commuting home that night on the phone, juggling emails with Nagosh, I would never have been able to
At least
pilfer the entire location.
At least you haven't described him as no longer being with us, which is what you said last time. Inferring he
R.I.P.
passed on.
I thought that was the chairman that said that.
Well, maybe it was.
Even better.
So look, we did talk about coming up with a couple of.
We've discussed that in detail. Let's do touch on some pros though, because there are some good things and some well considered thoughts to put forward to everyone about buying some 2024. Definitely. One of my favourites is, which we all discussed as a group, podcast 2 or 3 ago, where you're going to be in a position down the line where you want to have some lovely drinking claret at £30-40 a bottle, which you can't really find too easily necessarily at the moment with those other vintages that we've had recently. Where with some of these release prices in 3 years, 4 years, and I do think these will be drinking. And this, I'm not going to go too much into the blind tasting, but I actually was Team 21 more than 2017. I'm surprised. One of the big takeaways I had from the blind was how.
Have you been told what the wines were then?
I know what they are now. Yeah.
Okay, I have.
Yeah, no, so I have. So I mean, I really enjoyed 21. I didn't expect it.
And they were very approachable, weren't
Yeah,
they? I mean,
really are.
You could actually imagine drinking some of those 21s now.
Yeah, because they're fresh, which you'd expect, but they have an actual ripeness and a concentration that I didn't expect to have. Anyway, we will do a separate point now because it was fascinating. But the point being is these 24s, I think, will mimic that, and you can have some. And picking up some cases. We talked about PKU, but previously and other ones, but certainly between 120 and 200 pounds, there's a real sort of selection.
A six pack.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which we can guide you.
And I've got two that in that category that I would put up straight away. I mean, there was no Le Grand Pomerol, which would typically sit in that slot as well. But Rouget and Pomerol and Branair and Saint Julien.
Yeah.
I mean, comfortably sub 200 a six pack. They'd be two wines that I think I'll probably try and snaffle a six pack of. And then maybe slightly sort of higher up the tree, but I thought Bel-Air Mélange and La Tour Pomme were both brilliant. But Léville Poiffré, I think Léville Poiffré is a second growth, always quite a sort of glamorous wine. I like the sort of juiciness of Poiffré. So those were a few of my sort of observations.
Yeah, I mean, if I was going to name, just push comes to shove, there's one estate at the top end and one estate at the more earlier accessible. Excuse me, the earlier accessible end. Then it's rather dull. And this is using all my entire mental matrix of pricing, overall quality, etc.
Stop making excuses. Come on, what are they?
Petrus would have to be the first. Petrus is because I thought it was the best wine I tasted from 2024.
I think it was my high score.
Yeah, and the price is very good. It makes.
You haven't actually released the offer.
I know we haven't, but it does make total sense. So I can't not give that as the nod. And then actually, you stole mine because I was going to say Rouget. I think Rouget, I scored it, in the last podcast, I scored it very highly. And I think the price is brilliant. And those were the two that I
red mullet all round.
Pomerol heavy for me, yeah. Guy, would you like to venture?
I would. I mean, I think I might have spoken on the previous podcast about Pavillon Rouge, and it's not second wines, I think, in general, are possibly to be taken with a hint of caution this year. But I think the fact that they have just been so rigorous about it, and frankly, they have a further level to which they can declassify if needed. I think Pavillon Rouge was beautiful this year, and the whole Margot tasting experience really left me quite excited. And it's doubly perplexing in that sense that we haven't done that great a job in terms of selling the wines, because I thought Pavillon Rouge was beautiful, and to come out at the price, Joe, you've probably got it in front of you what it was, but whatever the price was, it was more than reasonable. And I would
528.6,
yeah, 528.6. So I mean, at less than £100 in bond for a bottle of that, I think is great. And on a similar, I mean, Petrus, I was going to say as well. So you've stolen my thunder on that one as well. But I genuinely think that Petrus is one of the wines of the vintage, if not the wine of the vintage. Olivier always speaks about this kind of holding on for ultimate, well, not ultimate ripeness, but just holding on for ripeness. And he sort of very endearingly speaks about Petrus as if it's the person, So he sort of says, well, Petrus doesn't like it when it's underripe. And so he describes this kind of angst-ridden process of holding on and losing crop and losing yield and just waiting until the right moment to pick. And the growing season at Petrus was stretched to a month longer than usual. But they got there. They got this amazing amount of ripeness. It's not the most big, boisterous, full-bodied Petrus that you'll taste by a long way, but he preserved this kind of aromatic beauty in Petrus, and I think that's really one of the wines of the vintage.
Quite similar to I don't like this room when I'm too much when I'm in here for an awful amount of time. I seem to overheat and get a little bit red. Exactly similar way. Doesn't like it underripe. I do not have this room too hot.
For me, when I was looking at the recap that myself and Max have been doing the last couple of weeks, it's quite nice to see prices against last year and scores and how they relate VAV to each other. So at the low end for me, Paul and Calvin, when he came in, PKU, great wines. I mean, you can't argue at the prices there. 88 at 6 for the Sauvignon Blanc and 120 for the Rouge. There's some great bargains to be had across most appellations, actually. GPL, credit 213 at 6. I mean, that's got to be one of the cheapest available on the market there. I was looking this morning and I asked Max because I wasn't sure if I'd seen an offer for Lafon Rocher because the only reason I raised it because
It's a good point.
I was thinking about last week and me lending you my umbrella. And I was thinking maybe you could buy me and losing my umbrella and hoping to see it back in
within 25 minutes as well.
But they haven't released the 2024, strangely. So maybe they've taken heed and
Do you think if we
release it in
do a good enough job, we might get a free umbrella out?
But that's part of the Lorenzetti. So was there did Pedesclo come out? Or have they?
I'm not sure.
I've got a feeling I have seen Pedesclo.
Okay.
Same. Quite early. Yeah.
I digress. A couple of things from Saint-Emilion, Beauchageur, Bécotte, La Cafelière, both under 230 quid a 3. A 6 size, so amazing wines there. I'm just looking at like key appellations and what would be the star appellation of the year because there's always concerns about the rain and what was going to be
I
too
think
much of an influence.
Unusual because I think it's two of the communes that often are the most sporadic or the most is Margaux and Saint-Emilion, which often really slightly lack. They have stars and then they have, I can't quite get my head around what Margaux is sometimes, but actually this year it was far more consistent in quality than I can remember it being in terms of the sort of range between top and bottom. I mean, Saint-Julien has such a high number of good properties, and almost everything in Saint-Julien is a name, if you know what I mean. It's about sort of 12 to 14.
It feels it delivers, doesn't it?
Yeah, so it often does. But Saint-Emilion, I thought, a lot of the wines, and it's a big commune, lots of chateaux, and obviously we didn't taste absolutely everything. But I thought, whereas Pomerol's normally very consistent, it was very consistent. But Saint-Emilion can normally be a little bit all over the shop, and it really wasn't. It was.
Is it too late to say a right bank vintage? Looking at some of the scores out there, I mean, there seems to be a nod to the right bank more so.
I don't know. It'd be interesting to agree. Personally, I didn't feel it was as obvious as maybe in other vintages. That
I think it was a little bit right bank orientated, but I don't necessarily think that the reason for that. I think the reason for that is that the estates are slightly smaller. On the right bank, and there was so much manpower and man hours, so many man hours needed that they could keep that under control. So I'm not so convinced that it's a sort of a weather thing.
Not that it's sort of. I mean, it's more sort of our opinion that we aim to put through on this podcast. But Winelist do a very interesting sort of piece of analysis on critic scores, and the top scoring appellations in ranking order were Pomerol, then Pauillac, then White Bordeaux, which they treat as one kind of generic thing, and then Saint-Emilion. So, I mean, I think that roughly kind of ties in with what we've been saying. I mean, Saint-Emilion to see in the top 4 is great, given how disparate and big a commune that is. Pomerol, I suspect, is probably unsurprising, and Pauillac as well. But the whites, it's a good white vintage. This is something that probably doesn't get the same impetus on primeur because, the availability is there of the whites outside some of the top names like the sort of Haut-Brion whites and Pavillon.
Well, talking about what we would recommend people to drink now, if you like white Bordeaux, go and find 17 and 21 white Bordeauxs. Find the chateaus you like, and then buy their 24s. I think would be a sound piece of advice. I'm a big fan. I really like white Bordeaux. I think it does have a bit of this sort of anti-Sauvignon snobbery going on at times that, I just can't get on with Sauvignon, which I think is quite, dare I say it, quite a lazy attitude because I think Sauvignon can be very different.
Yes, it can.
It's a little bit like the anything but Chardonnay sort of movement after we had all the oaky Aussie Chardonnays and then people wanted steelier wines and fruited wines. And I understood that, but I think Sauvignon's actually a cracking grape variety when it's done right.
When it's handled right.
What do you think about Viognier?
Well, you see, technically that's my jumbo of death white grape variety, but there are a few good examples. But it's not totally my bag.
That's a podcast in itself.
Exactly. Yeah.
I could happily dodge Viognier. I would just, I would like to add, after your Lister report there, I agree with Mr. Hargrave. I think Saint-Emilion
Sensible
was
to do that.
so often is very varied, had far more consistency. I preferred it. I think overall, if you took every estate I tried from Pomeroy and Saint-Emilion into account, I'd probably rate Saint-Emilion slightly higher.
Yeah.
I just think if your palate certainly has, it sort of gravitates towards wanting that sort of limestone presence within the wine, where Pomerol, I love that generosity and that sort of clay character, and the very best did brilliant examples of that. I think with 24 sort of suits it a little bit more, where you've got a little bit more precision and focus, and but in a really finessed way, because sometimes for me Saint-Emilion could be so big and so structured that you lose an element of that. So
It was a massively Parkerized commune, wasn't it?
it was, you're right. Yeah.
Back in the day, there was a lot of winemaking, a lot of extraction going on in many places.
But I think in a vintage where you don't have that layer of fruit, which did happen in 22, and I think the 22s are going to be great. I think they will be a standout vintage of modern times, along with 19 potentially. But you did have this veneer of fruit, and so it was quite hard to get underneath and see the limestone influence. Whereas in 24, you almost have that kind of direct visibility of the limestone. So it stands out.
Yeah. Right. Well, I guess, Mark, one question for you. You looking forward to taking it back to the borderline?
Looking forward to a holiday. I'm going to relay this all back to each and every negotiator I work with.
Just before anyone thinks that Mark is Bordeaux buyer, he doesn't now have 10 months off. He'll be in the breaking team and liaising with all the negotiators
for a couple of months.
Yeah. Eke out some of those old vintages, please. And
I am off to Bordeaux next week.
Oh, you maybe get another umbrella.
So hope it's not raining.
Let's we'll wrap it up there, and it's definitely been a very interesting campaign from various different aspects, and I've enjoyed chatting about it, seeing how it's unfurled, and there's some lovely wines to have. Still keep in contact. Still keep in contact, because there's some good wines to still add to your cellar and to your reserves, and some which we should just take delivery straight away when they come in. But yeah, anything else you'd like to add, Will, Guy, or Mark?
No, I mean, I just add on a note of positivity that, okay, the market is in a tricky place, but, we love the wines. We will continue to love the wines. And I think there are some great people making wine in Bordeaux. I love the place. I love the people. I'm very positive about what the future may hold, but there are some structural things that need looking at in the meantime. But
change is required. But
well, I'm looking for. I'm going to have a Unpicked 22 tonight, just to see how that is. I don't know if it was in our tasting yesterday. I don't think it was, but I'm going to see how that is. So see better. Thank you, Joseph.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And on that taste now, I had a cheeky bowl of Pavie 82 birthday at lunch yesterday. It was delightful. Parker scored it 88 points, and in 2009 said it will last maybe another 2 to 3 years. I'll leave it on that.